What if I tell you that the biggest liar, the biggest deceiver to ever exist in your life is your own brain? Welcome back to Illuminate. Today is our third episode, and what I'd like to discuss with you about today are the limitations of our human brain. For most of my life, I've always been about to see is to believe. If I didn't experience it, it's not true. You know, I thought I was being really scientific and being really clever because I think that it's rational to only believe what you experience and what you see. But when you actually dig deep into the chemistry of our brains and the way it works, and even how our mind works, and the fact that we hardly really know anything about the nature of consciousness, and we're just about cracking the surface of that big question, tells me that there's so much more we don't know, and therefore there's so much more that we can't know about our perceptions and the way our mind works and the way our senses receive information from our environment. And I think it's one of the most important things for us to really question how our brain really works and what are the limitations around it, so that we can realize that whenever we make decisions, whenever we start having thoughts, and especially when we're feeling unhappy about something or about someone, we need to take into account the fact that whatever it is that we're thinking may very well just be an illusion. It may just be something that our brains came up with, or some secret that our brains are hiding from us, because it does hide a lot of secrets from us if you look at it that way. And it's definitely an exaggeration to say that our brains are evil and are lying to us and are, they're working against us. It's not like that at all. In fact, the reason why our brain does what it does is because it's trying to protect us. Now, a really good example of this is the phenomenon called cognitive dissonance, which was first proposed by Leon Festinger back in the 1950s. I'm sure some of you have heard about this already, and it's actually quite a commonly used term. But it's just a simple thing, really. What it means, cognitive dissonance, is the inability of our brains to hold two conflicting thoughts, beliefs, or actions as a result of thoughts and beliefs at the same time. Now, that sounds familiar. For me, it's a massive revelation, because I just realized procrastination is just a form of cognitive dissonance. I have this belief about myself that I'm lazy, Maybe it's because my parents were very strict on me growing up, Asian parents and all that. And I just always felt like I'm not doing enough, even though I did really well academically. But when I know that I have to do something, and yet I hold that belief that I'm lazy, I end up not doing that action. I end up in a freeze mode, because my belief, my action of doing something doesn't really align with my long-held subconscious and maybe even conscious belief that I am lazy. So really, really important for us to identify times in our lives when we're having that cognitive dissonance. And often it's the symptom is like feeling really bad, or freezing, or feeling stuck, not knowing what to do, because there's probably your brain it's kind of malfunctioning, trying to process like, oh wait, but you believe this and yet you're gonna do this? What? Something has to change here. And that's causing the freeze mode. And at some point after that freeze mode, you're gonna start having this change in belief, or change in the action that you originally wanted to take, or a change in thought. So it's really what shapes us in a way. Whether we go right side or left side, up or down, it really depends on our willpower to go towards, maybe the more comfortable or less comfortable part of the story. But not all psychological biases are bad necessarily. Some are, I would say, a bit neutral. At least from my perspective, it's neutral. And one such example is the Dunning-Kruger effect. This psychological phenomenon was identified by David Dunning and Justin Kruger, and it's simply the interesting brain quirk that we have where the less we know about something, the more confident we seem to be about it. When you think about it, that's actually not such a bad thing, because confidence is so important. The way we present ourselves in this day and age is so important. So maybe sometimes knowing too much about a topic and just going into a rabbit hole and realizing how much you don't know is not the best way to move forward if there's an outcome you really, really don't push. And I think that's also the reason why a lot of very confident people become successful, even though you think they're not really the foremost experts in their field, because the way they talk about it and the way they present themselves is so confident that therefore they must know what they're talking about. You can see how sometimes the brain is actually working on our favor in these situations. And that's actually exemplified by a lot of other types of cognitive biases, such as the confirmation bias, where you look for and seek information that is in alignment with your beliefs, and that makes what you believe in stronger in your head, even though maybe you're actually having a confirmation bias. And then there's another type of bias called a self-serving bias, where you attribute successes to yourself but failures to external factors. Now that's really, actually, if you think about it, it's not a bad thing because it protects your self-esteem. But nonetheless, it is a bias, and it isn't really an objective view that you think you're having whenever you're making statements or declarations about something. The last psychological phenomena that I want to discuss is what I think is really, really dangerous, because it's to do with memory. We already know that our memory isn't really accurate and we forget a lot of things, but this is called the mood congruent memory bias. Now, what is this mood congruent memory bias? This theory tells us that how we remember things, or what we remember about something in the past, is actually greatly affected by our current mood. So if we're feeling really annoyed at someone and then we recall a situation that you had with that someone, even if it's neutral, you're going to remember the bad things or the bad experiences. Whereas if we're in a good mood, we might then recall the good experiences. So not only do our brains deceive us, but our emotions is kind of in cahoots with the brain in deceiving us. But what's actually happening in our brain whenever we have these biases? Why is it that we go on one side and not the other for a lot of the decisions that we make in our lives? That can be explained by the idea of neural pathways. Neural pathways are responsible for transmitting information between different parts of the brain and between our brain and our body. So whenever we learn something new, for example, that creates a new neural pathway in our brain. Whenever we react to a certain stimuli, and that keeps on getting repeated, that then creates a neural pathway that the next time it happens, we will have an instinctive reaction to it. What's more interesting is this idea of neuroplasticity. Now, neuroplasticity has been studied extensively in the past few decades, and it's only now that we've really come to see how important it is in the way we decide on things, in the way we learn things, in our cognitive biases as well. And that is because neuroplasticity simply means that our brain is not a fixed system. So just because maybe that you've practiced a habit or you've practiced a thought doesn't mean it's always going to be there, because our brain actually have the capacity to change that neural pathway into something else, or to create a completely new neural pathway. Now, how does this relate to cognitive biases? So in the case of cognitive dissonance, for example, the moment that you have a misalignment of two beliefs or a thought and a belief, what your brain does is create a new belief in order to accommodate for the thought or the action. So that's interesting, right? Because it means that you can actually change your belief. You can also change the habit, for example, by trying to reinforce a new neural pathway, by trying to form a new habit, which is why they say, if you do something for 21 days, that will become your habit. And if you want to change a habit, try not to do that thing for a certain period of time and do something else instead. And in that way, you are reinforcing the new neural pathway of this new habit that you're trying to form and weakening the old habit that you're trying to get rid of. Overall, what's interesting is that our brains are, it's like clay, like it can be constantly molded. And it also tells us why in childhood, when we don't have a lot of neural pathways in our minds or in our brains, means that there's more ability or more openness for us to learn. However, of course, we grow up and we're exposed to environmental factors, we're exposed to people and people's beliefs, and those beliefs then become neural pathways in our brains. It's important to ask ourselves the question, what does my brain look like if I were to draw it and it were a kind of city? What are those neural pathways? What are the streets? What are the biggest streets in my brain? And do I really want to keep that street? Is it efficient? Is it good? Another interesting scientific theory, or maybe I would even call this a scientific fact, is how are we actually taking in information via our senses? And one of the most interesting things that I've heard or I've read about is when we use our eyes to see something, we're actually slightly looking back a few nanoseconds into the past. So what we're seeing is actually not the now, but rather a few nanoseconds ago, simply because of the journey that light has to go through to get to our eyes and then have that reflected back, say if you're looking at yourself in the mirror. And that takes some time, maybe not the kind of time that you can easily perceive, but it does take some time before we start seeing the image on that mirror. That's really to do with the speed of light. So if the speed of light were reduced to, say, instead of taking a few nanoseconds for you to see the reflection on the mirror, and it actually takes 3 seconds, and you smile now, it'll take you about 3 seconds for the mirror to actually smile back at you. In terms of what we can hear, for example, what we can hear is really different from what other mammals can hear. So dogs and other animals can hear higher frequencies, and so their sound landscape is really different from ours. So that's really interesting because our senses aren't perfect. Our vision and our perception of time through our senses aren't perfect. So in a way, what is reality? Are we actually seeing what is, or are we just seeing what is based on what our brain can handle? And therefore, on that note, to see is not necessarily to believe. Sometimes belief goes beyond what we can perceive with our 5 senses. But let's go even further down the line of our ability to sense things. And let's think about consciousness. Consciousness, after all, is the very reason why you can sense everything in your environment and make decisions and live in general. So one of the more interesting theories, more recent theories that scientists have proposed to explain consciousness is that of what they call the orchestrated objective reduction theory of consciousness, proposed by Sir Roger Penrose. And what it is that in our neurons are these structures called microtubules. And within these microtubules contain quantum processes that when it collapses, consciousness arises from it. And these quantum processes are also fundamentally linked to the way the universe works. So it's really amazing how these tiny structures in our brain is intricately connected to the fabric of the universe. So who knows, right? Who knows if we're just imagining everything after all. So I'll put a link below if anyone wants to go deeper into that study. I really highly recommend it. It's very, very interesting. And it really makes you question, given the nature of quantum states, what reality is. And I think I've covered that in the first episode, but yeah. Now, philosophically, Friedrich Nietzsche has a really interesting thought about this, and he calls it perspectivism. And perspectivism is simply the idea that we are unable to perceive absolute truth or absolute reality completely. And we can only really see reality from our perspective. And from what we've discussed so far, that makes sense because we are limited by our biology. We are limited by our five senses. And the philosopher Immanuel Kant also touches upon this subject, where he separated what he calls phenomena to noumena. Phenomena is what things that happen or things that we can perceive that is solely based on our human senses. And noumena are things that are independent of these senses, or what you might call the absolute truth. And he proposes that there's no way that we are able to experience noumena. And actually, Plato also touched upon this in the allegory of the cave, where he describes, imagine a group of human beings that live their entire lives chained in a cave with only a fire. And then they would see the shadows on the wall created by puppeteers, and they will think that that is their reality and that's their perception of everything. And say, for example, someone goes out and realizes that everything was an illusion. That person at some point comes back and couldn't see anymore in the dark. And then everyone else who still are chained in that cave now think that going outside of this illusion, going outside of this prison, is a bad thing. So our brains have a way of protecting us in that sense. Our brains have a way of wanting to keep us in our comfort zones. So now that we've established that, yes, our brains are limited, yes, our perception and our ability to sense things are limited, what is beyond that? I've always asked myself the question, like, if I am not a human being and I can perceive a lot more than a human being can perceive, what will I see? And for me, the answer was pursuing more spiritual and physical topics, because those mystical topics actually allow me to see beyond the illusion of that cave that Plato described. And in a lot of the more new age spiritual beliefs, there's always this mind over matter, psychic phenomena, and they link that to quantum processes. Might it be that a lot of the things that we think we don't know, or are simply things that are impossible or magical, are simply scientific truths waiting to be discovered? A lot of these thoughts have really piqued my curiosity in the question of how can, with our human bodies, with our human limitations, how can we experience absolute truth? Because surely that must be a wonderful experience, like absolute truth, right? And I think that the way to do it is to understand spirituality more. And I'm not talking about just religion, but also like mystical traditions and New Age spirituality. And in fact, in New Age spirituality, they start talking about things that are by nature mind over matter is a result of quantum processes. So I find it really fascinating. And I think we should all really think about this and realize that we are very limited. And it's not necessarily such a bad thing. And I think there is a way out of this limitation. And I think maybe this is how we are going to evolve as humans in our next level of evolution. And perhaps a lot of the things we are experiencing, all the challenges that we experience in life, is simply a way for us to force us almost to evolve into beings that are more perceptive of that absolute reality, as opposed to just being limited by our biology and by our human perception and our senses. Right, everyone, that's it for me. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you next week. Bye.